He was called El Deseado, the Desired One. But behind palace walls, Spain's most hated king ruled not with armies, but with his hands. Ferdinand VII rewrote laws for his own lust, forced queens to the brink of death, and turned a cedar chest into a silent archive of blood-stained cloths. Each one tied to a name, a date, a ruined life. His cruelty didn't just break bodies, it poisoned the crown itself, and the nation bled for generations. From which city are you watching us right now, and what's your local time? And would you like to share why you can't sleep tonight? Now let's begin the story of the most ruthless man in history. The royal palace rises against the night like a mountain of marble and gold. Inside, its corridors glow under 1,000 flickering candles, their flames shivering in the breath of autumn air that creeps through the half-open shutters. Silk drapes sway gently, whispering against the cold stone walls. Somewhere far below, the muffled sounds of celebration drift upward, the soft echo of music, the fading murmur of nobles offering their congratulations, the clink of crystal goblets. In the heart of the palace, in a bedchamber lined with gilded mirrors and heavy tapestries, a child sits alone. 16 years old, Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony clutches a rosary so tightly the beads leave dents in her skin. Raised in the cloisters of a convent, she has never walked through a ballroom, never danced with a suitor, never heard the crude laughter of men. Her world has been one of candlelit prayers, polished chapel floors, and the quiet rustle of nuns' skirts as they passed down narrow hallways. She still believes that babies come from the beaks of storks, delivered like divine gifts into waiting arms. No one has told her otherwise. No one has dared. Now dressed in a white muslin nightdress, stiff with starch, she sits on the edge of the royal bed, a towering structure draped in red velvet and embroidered with golden lions, and waits. The chamber smells faintly of beeswax polish and roses, though beneath it is a hint of something metallic, like cold iron. The door opens. He steps inside, Ferdinand VII, King of Spain, 35 years old. His body, already swollen from years of indulgence, carries the pallor of sickness. Splotches bloom across his skin like bruises on overripe fruit. His lips hang thick and wet, his breath faintly sweet and sour from wine. His eyes, however, are alive, too alive, carrying a glint not of affection, but of hunger. The portraits had lied. The painted Ferdinand, hanging in the palace corridors, shows a noble figure with broad shoulders and a proud jaw. The man before her is a ruin of that image, a shadow of a prince. Maria Josepha's gaze drops to the floor. She has been taught to obey, to submit to the will of God and husband alike. But what she feels now is not the gentle weight of duty. It is the crushing force of dread. He approaches, and in that slow, deliberate advance, she senses something wrong, something beyond the bloat, beyond the stench of perfume layered over sickness, a presence that feels less like a husband and more like a predator stepping into the den. Later, historians will argue about the details of this moment. Some will whisper of Ferdinand's medical condition, of the grotesque proportions hidden beneath his robes, an anatomy so mismatched to the human body that it inspires not awe, but terror. But Maria Josepha doesn't need medical terminology. She only knows that what stands before her is wrong. Her pulse quickens, the rosary digs into her palm. She backs away. He smiles, a slow, heavy curve of the lips, and keeps moving forward. She runs. The muslin nightdress swirls around her legs as she flees across the chamber, past the carved walnut writing desk and the marble hearth where the fire has burned low. Her bare feet slap against the polished floor. Behind her comes the sound of pursuit, the slap of flesh, the grunt of effort, the shuffle of a man unused to moving quickly. This is no courtly chase. This is a hunt. But Maria Josepha is young, and fear gives her speed. She reaches the far door and wrenches it open, vanishing into the narrow servants' corridor beyond. Ferdinand stops short, breathing heavily. The prey is gone. And then something in him breaks. He storms from the room, not in the silent retreat of a rejected man, but in the bellowing fury of a king denied his right. Naked, unashamed, he bursts into the hallway, shouting obscenities. Servants scatter as he waves his grotesque deformity like a banner, calling the queen's ladies-in-waiting whores and savages. 15 minutes, he roars. Make her ready. 15 minutes to explain to a convent-raised child what no one had dared tell her before. 15 minutes to coax her back into the bedchamber, to prepare her for an act meant to be sacred, but now stripped bare as ritualized terror. The women, some loyal to him, some merely trapped by duty, do as they're told. They speak in low voices, their words awkward, their eyes avoiding hers. Maria Josepha listens without moving, the rosary still clenched in her hands. She does not cry. She simply falls silent, as though retreating into some inner chapel where he cannot follow. When Ferdinand returns, expecting compliance, he finds something else, a smell, sharp, unmistakable. In her terror, Maria Josepha has soiled herself. The human body, pushed beyond fear, has betrayed her. The bed, draped in royal velvet, now holds the evidence of horror. Not the imagined purity of a bridal night, but waste, a raw, undeniable sign that what has been attempted here is not union, but violation. Ferdinand recoils, not out of sympathy, not out of shame, but out of disgust. Queens, he sneers, do not smell of civet. And with that, he leaves. For over a week, he does not return to her bed. But absence is not mercy. Absence is strategy, the waiting period of a predator who believes he owns the prey. In that first night, something more than a marriage has broken. The carefully painted illusion of noble union, of marriage as sacred duty, rots away. And in its place, a new pattern emerges, one that will define Ferdinand's reign far more than any treaty or decree. A pattern of dominance, of humiliation, of bodies treated as political instruments. Because for Ferdinand VII, this was never just about desire. It was about proving something, to himself, to the court, to the whispers that had followed him since youth. He will prove it in the bedchamber. He will prove it in the streets of Madrid. And soon, he will prove it to all of Spain. But before the story can follow him into the city's underworld, before the palace nights turn into hunts, there is a truth that must be understood, the paradox that fuels him. For Ferdinand is both king and captive, captive to his own body, captive to the humiliation that shaped him, and yet king enough to turn that captivity into a weapon. And in that paradox lies the seed of his reign. The coronation crown of Spain gleams under the vaulted ceiling of the royal chapel, a circle of gold and jewels, blessed by bishops, kissed by generations. To the watching crowds, it is the very image of divine order, proof that God still guides the fate of kingdoms. But to Ferdinand VII, the crown is more than a relic of tradition. It is armor. Armor against whispers. Armor against the one truth no ceremony can erase. He wears it as others wear a mask. For beneath the gold and velvet robes, beneath the sashes and medals, there is a body that betrays him, a grotesque paradox of form. His anatomy, the very part of him meant to secure the future of his dynasty, is the source of his deepest humiliation. It is whispered about in Paris salons, smirked over in Vienna, muttered in the private apartments of the Escorial. A shape so strange, so mismatched to the human form, that it inspires not awe, but dread. In The Logic of Kingship, virility is not a private matter. It is a public currency. The silent promise that the bloodline will continue, that the realm will not fracture when the king dies. But Ferdinand's body, swollen from years of indulgence, marked with the signs of disease, carries a secret that gnaws at that promise. His first wife's miscarriages, his second wife's fatal delivery, his third wife's refusal to yield. Each failure is not just personal, it is political. And in the salons of Europe, they talk. The ambassador of one court writes discreetly to another, "The King of Spain is unfit for the marriage bed." In Vienna, a diplomat describes him as mal formado, malformed. In Naples, his name is followed by quiet laughter. For Ferdinand, these are not harmless rumors. They are wounds, and every wound demands an answer. In public, he plays the role expected of him. He kneels before altars, swears oaths upon the Bible, presides over councils with the solemnity of a ruler chosen by God. The liturgy of monarchy wraps him in an aura of sanctity. But behind closed doors, another liturgy unfolds, one written not in holy scripture, but in the dark language of humiliation and revenge. If his body cannot serve its purpose as nature intended, then it will serve as he intends. What it cannot achieve in love, it will achieve in conquest. Here lies the paradox at the heart of Ferdinand's reign. The same deformity that shames him becomes his weapon. He will take what he was mocked for and make it the source of fear. He will turn the object of ridicule into the instrument of submission. For the King of Spain, the bed will not be a place of union. It will be a battlefield, and virgin blood will be the banner he raises over it. In the great history of monarchs, wars are fought for territory, for gold, for the glory of dynasties. But Ferdinand's private war is fought for something smaller, stranger, more intimate. The proof that he can dominate where nature denied him ease. Each woman he takes is a message, each conquest a declaration that the crown still commands obedience in its most primal form. In this way, his personal failings become affairs of state. A queen's miscarriage is not a private grief, it is a public crisis. A teenage bride's terror becomes a political embarrassment. The secrecy surrounding his marital chambers is not simply discretion, it is a diplomatic necessity. His sexual history is not gossip, but strategy, whispered about by ministers and manipulated by enemies. The irony is almost too sharp to bear. The king's most dangerous weapon is also his deepest shame. By day, he sits upon the throne, dispensing justice, signing decrees, projecting the image of pious authority. By night, the throne is replaced by a bed, and the king becomes executioner in another sense, executing his will upon bodies too young or too powerless to refuse. And in both arenas, the rituals are eerily similar. In the council chamber, the king's word is final. In the bedchamber, the king's touch is law. In the throne room, courtiers bow. In the shadows of the bed, women submit. The symbols overlap until they are indistinguishable. Ferdinand begins to see them as one. The governance of Spain and the governance of a woman's body merge into the same act of control. There is a certain poetry in the way Ferdinand cultivates this double image. Pious ruler by daylight, predator by candlelight. He understands that contradiction is not weakness if it is wielded with precision. The people, the clergy, even his own court, can be made to accept any cruelty, any transgression, if it is cloaked in the garments of tradition and faith. He kneels in church after nights of degradation. He receives the sacraments with the same lips that hurled obscenities hours before. Bishops bless him, the Pope writes to him, and the crown remains upon his head. To be a king is to be untouchable. And Ferdinand intends to stretch that immunity to its furthest limits. The paradox deepens with each year. The deformity that should have ended his line becomes the axis around which his reign spins. The weakness that should have humbled him instead hardens into a weapon. And the role of king, meant to inspire awe, becomes instead a stage for the performance of cruelty. Every humiliation he suffered in youth, the laughter, the whispers, the cold rejections, is repaid tenfold in the bodies of others, and every act of violence reinforces his belief that the crown is his license to rewrite the terms of nature itself. The court begins to learn the pattern. They see how political decisions align with his private fixations, how rebellion in the provinces is followed not just by arrests, but by sudden visits to brothels, how the daughters of political prisoners are summoned to the palace under vague pretenses, how the cedar chest in his chambers, the one no one dares to open, grows heavier with each passing year. The paradox becomes a machine. The king's shame fuels his cruelty. His cruelty reinforces his sense of power. His power shields him from consequence. His shield allows the shame to fester unchecked. And so, the cycle continues. To the outside world, this contradiction is invisible. The marble facades of the palace hide the damp air of its corridors. The public portraits conceal the sickly complexion beneath the powder. Foreign envoys see the gilded salons, the processions, the masses sung in echoing chapels. They do not see, or do not wish to see, the young women leaving the private apartments with eyes fixed on the ground. But inside Spain, the truth circulates like a rumor that never quite dies. Servants whisper it to each other in kitchens. Noble women tell it in guarded tones at the edges of balls. Priests hear it in confession and bury it under layers of sanctity. The contradiction has become the country's unspoken reality. A king chosen by God, yet damned by his own nature. And in this paradox, Ferdinand finds something intoxicating. Because to rule as a monarch is to be both man and symbol. Most kings are humbled by this duality. Ferdinand thrives on it. He knows that his body may be flawed, but the crown on his head can make that flaw into a sign of untouchable power. The very thing that should have broken him instead becomes the justification for everything he does. If he is cursed, then Spain will live under that curse. If he is malformed, then the kingdom will bend itself to fit his shape. But monsters are not born fully formed. They are shaped. And before Ferdinand can wield his paradox as a weapon, we must see how it was forged. We must go back into the cold corridors of his boyhood to find the moment when shame first took root and began to bloom into something far darker. The boy's chamber is dark, save for the faint glow of a single oil lamp. Its wick burns low, casting a trembling light across the small figure huddled beneath heavy bedclothes. Ferdinand, not yet 10, pulls the blanket tighter around him, gripping the fabric in both fists, as if it could shield him from the world beyond the bed. In the corridors outside, the footsteps of servants echo like distant drums. The palace never sleeps, but for the boy, its constant murmur is not comfort. It is threat. Every door creak feels like intrusion. Every shadow against the wall is a shape that might come closer. He is pale, thin from recurring fevers, his skin translucent under the lamplight. Tutors complain he is delicate, unfit for rough games. He is excused from riding in cold weather, kept away from drafts, and bundled in wool until sweat pools at the base of his neck. But the fragility that keeps him alive also isolates him. In the silent cruelty of royal courts, weakness is an open wound, and everyone learns to press it. By day, he faces the scrutiny of his instructors. There is Latin to be memorized, scripture to be recited, endless histories to be copied in careful ink. But there are other lessons, more awkward and more terrifying, the ones about the body. The first time a tutor brings out the anatomical drawings, Ferdinand freezes. The parchment shows naked figures, muscles exposed, strange cross-sections of limbs and organs. The other boys glance, smirk, and look away. Ferdinand turns his head, refusing to meet the image at all. "Look," the tutor insists, tapping the diagram with a thin stick. A prince must know how the body works. But he will not. He stares at the floor until the lesson ends. The same refusal appears in riding practice, in fencing drills, any moment when strength or form is on display. He changes clothes only in darkness, even as a child. He avoids mirrors. He avoids being touched. In the stillness of night, the palace walls carry sound too well. Whispers seep through stone. The maids who speak of his strangeness, the stable boys who laugh about the sick little prince. He hears it all, though no one believes he does. And perhaps, though no proof remains, there are darker whispers. Some historians suspect the seed of his later cruelty may have been planted here in these vulnerable years by a hand that should not have touched him. A tutor, a servant, a family member. There is no evidence, only speculation, but the signs, the fear of touch, the obsession with privacy, the mingling of shame and rage, fit too neatly to dismiss. Whether by abuse or by humiliation, something begins to calcify inside the boy. He grows, but slowly, both in stature and in confidence. By adolescence, Ferdinand has learned the rules of survival. Avoid exposure. Avoid situations where his body might be judged. Speak less than others, and let silence be mistaken for authority. But silence is not strength. It is storage. Every insult, every smirk, every whisper is stored away, pressed deep into the layers of his mind, like embers under ash. The moment that changes everything comes not in a classroom or a court, but in a chapel. He is 17, kneeling before the altar, his head bowed in prayer. The archbishop's sermon swells through the vaulted space. The king is chosen by God. The king's authority is divine. His will is law. The words strike Ferdinand like a key turning in a lock. If a king is chosen by God, then no man may question him. If his will is law, then even his body, flawed though it may be, is sanctified by that same divine right. Whatever else the court might think, whatever else the whispers may say, the crown will place him above them all. It is this conviction he carries into his first marriage in 1802 to Maria Antonia of Naples, his cousin. She is 17, vivacious, politically astute, and almost immediately, the match begins to rot. The first night passes without consummation. The second, the third, the weeks stretch into months. The young bride writes desperate letters to her mother. He does not know what to do. He does not feel what a man should feel. At court, the whispers grow. Ferdinand tries, awkwardly, clumsily, to meet his duty. The attempts leave Maria Antonia bruised, sometimes bleeding. Physicians are summoned under cover of night, their advice reduced to embarrassed murmurs. For nearly a year, the marriage remains unconsummated. Then, finally, something shifts. Perhaps the shame of failure outweighs his fear. Perhaps cruelty, even then, stirs in him. One night, he forces the matter. Maria Antonia miscarries within weeks. The pattern repeats. Another attempt, another miscarriage. Her health declines rapidly. At 21, she is dead, officially of tuberculosis, though many suspect the truth is far more intimate. Ferdinand does not mourn as most men mourn. If there is grief, it is tangled with something else, a new understanding. The act that had once humiliated him has, at last, given him a sense of power. Not power through love or mutual desire, but power through control. It is a revelation that chills more than it consoles. The boy who had flinched from anatomy lessons has become the man who discovers that the body, any body, can be subdued. What he cannot inspire willingly, he can take by force, and the crown will protect him when he does. The years that follow deepen this transformation. Exile during Napoleon's occupation hardens him further. He returns to Madrid in 1814, not as a humbled ruler grateful for restoration, but as a man certain that his survival proves his invincibility. The courtiers who once mocked him bow low. The church that once looked askance now hails him as a savior. The embers of shame in his mind are fanned by this sudden wind of reverence. they flare into something hotter, sharper, the determination to never again feel small. By the time he marries again, Ferdinand is no longer the nervous boy prince or the hesitant groom. He is a king armed with the belief that his body is no obstacle if his will is absolute. His second wife, Maria Isabel of Braganza, will learn this to her cost. In public, he is affectionate enough to quiet gossip. In private, the lessons learned from Maria Antonia's short life are put into practice. He will not wait for consent. He will not risk humiliation. The bed is his throne, and the woman in it is his subject. This is Ferdinand's true awakening, not to passion, but to the efficiency of domination. It is not about pleasure, it is about certainty. He understands now that control in the private sphere feeds authority in the public one. If he can rule the body absolutely, he can rule the realm. And so, the making of the monster is complete. A child shaped by sickness and shame, a youth marked by whispers, a husband who learned to turn weakness into a weapon. And with the weapon forged, the hunt begins. It will not be confined to the palace walls. The streets of Madrid will soon see their kings not as a distant sovereign, but as a shadow moving among them, cloaked, unmasked, and searching. The private paradox will spill into public ritual. The city will become his hunting ground. Madrid after midnight is not the city sung about in courtly poems. The lamps burn low along its narrow streets, the stones slick with evening damp. The air tastes of wood smoke and cheap wine. From the distance, muffled laughter drifts from taverns, mingled with the clatter of cartwheels returning from the markets. The city sleeps in pockets, never entirely still, never entirely safe. And through this sleeping capital moves a figure wrapped in a black cloak. It is not disguise. Ferdinand VII never bothers with that. There is no attempt to hide his identity. The king's gait is slow, deliberate, as though each step is a statement. I am here, and I go where I please. Behind him, a small procession follows. Young noblemen, flushed with drink, their gold buttons winking in the lamplight. Some wear smirks, eager for the night's sport. Others glance over their shoulders, uneasy yet unwilling to be absent from the king's company. To refuse an invitation is to invite suspicion, and suspicion in Ferdinand's Spain can be a death sentence. They pass shuttered bakeries, the scent of stale bread lingering in the air. A stray dog trots after them for a few streets before veering away. Somewhere close, a window slams shut. The sound of someone who has seen the king's procession before and knows better than to linger at the glass. The destination is no secret. Everyone in Madrid's underworld knows where the king goes when the palace walls feel too tight. La Casa de Pepa. Pepa is a madam of rare skill, her brothel hidden in a side street that smells faintly of tallow and damp stone. The building itself is unremarkable. 2 stories, peeling plaster, shutters that seem always to be half closed. But inside, the rooms are lit by a low golden glow. Perfume mingles with candle smoke, thick enough to taste. Silk cushions are scattered across divans. The air hums with the clink of glasses, the rustle of skirts, the low laughter of women trained to make every man feel like a conqueror. Tonight, they do not need to pretend. The conqueror has arrived. The king sheds his cloak and steps into the main room. He does not greet Pepa. He does not need to. She approaches anyway, curtsying low, her rings flashing in the candlelight. Behind her, the women line the walls, each one careful not to meet his eyes unless he beckons. He rarely does. Instead, he moves to the center of the room, surrounded by his companions. Wine is poured, toasts are made, to the king, to Spain, to the night ahead. And then the game begins. They call it El Juego de la Medida, the measurement game. The rules are simple. One by one, the men expose themselves, lining up to be measured against the king. There is laughter at first, thin, brittle laughter. No one dares win. Even if they could, they wouldn't. Ferdinand always wins. In this moment, the deformity that once drew whispers in foreign courts becomes a grotesque badge of dominance. What others mocked in secret is now paraded as proof of superiority. For the king, it is a reclamation, not of dignity, but of control. He has taken the very thing that humiliated him and turned it into a weapon, forcing others to acknowledge it in the most public of private settings. But the game is only foreplay to the real business of the night. Beyond the candlelit main room, other doors lead to darker chambers. Ferdinand chooses not from the women who are ready, painted and smiling. He asks for names. Names whispered to him by courtiers, names sent by loyalists eager to curry favor. A servant girl from the palace kitchens, a widow whose husband died under suspicion of treason, a merchant's daughter too poor to refuse the summons. They are brought here, sometimes willingly, more often not, to be part of the king's private ritual. In those rooms, the air changes. The golden glow of the main hall fades into the sharper flicker of single candles. The perfume grows heavy, cloying, unable to mask the scent of sweat and fear. What happens next is not simply indulgence, it is extraction. Ferdinand takes what he wants, and when it is done, he ensures there is proof. Peppa provides the cloths, squares of fine linen, pale and clean. After each encounter, they are inspected, folded, and given to the king. Virgin blood is prized most of all. Each cloth is labeled in his own hand, the name, the date, sometimes the place where the girl was taken. The ink soaks into the fibers as permanently as the stains. These are not keepsakes of passion. They are records, evidence of conquest. Over time, the collection grows. Dozens of cloths stored in a cedar chest in the private quarters of the palace, wrapped in silk cords as if they were holy relics. The scent of cedar and linen cannot quite cover the underlying tang of iron. This is Ferdinand's true archive. Not the royal decrees signed in public view, not the treaties stored in the chancery, but these squares of stained linen hidden from history's official pages. They are his secret ledger of power, and like any ledger, it grows in proportion to his ambitions. The nights at Peppa's house become a rhythm. After council meetings where dissent is quashed, after executions where rebels swing in the plaza, Ferdinand and his chosen men descend into the city. The king drinks, plays his game, chooses his quarry, and each time a new cloth appears in the chest, the message is clear, and it is meant to be. In Ferdinand's Spain, disobedience is punished not just in the public square, but in the private chamber. Men may fear the gallows, but they fear more the summons that may come for their daughters, their sisters, their wives. The city learns to watch the black cloak in the streets. To see it pass is to know that somewhere, before morning, another name will be written in that careful royal script. Another cloth will be folded into the cedar chest. There is a bitter symmetry in these hunts. The boy who once feared the body now uses his to instill fear. The prince who hid from anatomy lessons now treats flesh as territory to be claimed. And the crown, symbol of divine order, becomes the silent accomplice to every act. Madrid becomes his map. The palace is his fortress. The brothels, his staging ground. The streets, his hunting trail. He needs no disguise because his power is his invisibility. Not the invisibility of hiding, but the invisibility of impunity. He walks openly, and no one dares to stop him. The nobles who accompany him learn quickly that these excursions are not optional entertainment. To be invited is to be tested. To refuse is to risk exile or worse. And so they drink. They laugh at his jokes. They applaud his victories in the Juego de la Medida. They play their parts in the theater of his dominance, knowing that at any moment, they too could be cast as prey if they step out of line. By the time the sun begins to pale the eastern sky, the procession returns to the palace. The king re-enters his chambers, the cedar chest waiting. Another cloth is placed inside, another entry, added to the unspoken history of Spain. The city stirs awake, unaware of the details, but aware enough of the pattern. Another family is silent at market. Another girl is absent from her usual errands. Another name whispered, and then quickly swallowed. And so the true history of Ferdinand VII is written, not in ink, but in stains, not on parchment, but on linen. One mark at a time, but the stains are not confined to fabric. Soon the king's private hunts will bleed into public governance. Punishment will be political and intimate all at once, rebellion crushed in the streets and in the bedrooms. Spain will learn that in Ferdinand's reign, the gallows and the bed are twin instruments of rule, and both are equally lethal. The plaza smells of smoke and iron. It is morning in Madrid, but the sky is the color of lead, and the air carries the sour tang of fear. Beneath the gallows, soldiers stand in rigid lines, their muskets gleaming with dew. A crowd has gathered, merchants, servants, beggars, and the curious elite, drawn by the promise of a royal execution. At the center of the stage is Colonel Joaquin Bermudez, once a decorated officer, now a condemned traitor. His crime? Siding with the liberals who dared demand a constitution, dared to suggest that the king's will might not be divine. His punishment? To hang, as an example to all who would challenge the crown. Ferdinand does not attend. He never does. His absence is calculated, as if to say that such matters are beneath his notice, but those who know him understand the truth. The execution is only half the punishment. The other half will take place in a room far from the square, where the crowd cannot see. The noose tightens, the trapdoor falls. The colonel's body jerks, then hangs limp. The murmurs of the crowd swell and break into silence. The priest makes the sign of the cross. Somewhere, in the shadow of the palace, his daughter waits. Ana Bermudez is 15 years old, her black dress hanging loosely over a frame, thinned by weeks of grief. She has been summoned, the letter bearing the royal seal delivered with icy formality. No explanation is given. She knows she must go. The carriage ride is silent, the hooves of the horses striking the cobblestones with a rhythm that feels like a countdown. Inside the palace, the corridors stretch long and cold. The guards avert their eyes. The servants do not speak. When she emerges hours later, she moves slowly, as if each step must be willed into existence. Her face is pale. Her eyes are fixed on the floor, and beneath her skirt, the linen she wore that morning is gone. That linen will appear days later in the cedar chest in the king's private chambers, folded, labeled in his precise handwriting, Anna, daughter of Bermudez, September 1823. It is not the first. It will not be the last. In Ferdinand's Spain, rebellion and degradation move together like shadow and flame. When the king's authority is challenged, in the streets, his retribution strikes twice, once in public, once in private. The men who raise arms or voices against him meet the gallows, the firing squad, or the prison cell. The women they leave behind, wives, daughters, sisters, are drawn into the other half of the punishment. It is not chance, it is policy. After each uprising, the pattern repeats. Soldiers sweep through the city, arrests are made, sentences carried out, and then, quietly, summons are issued to the female relatives of the condemned. Some are taken directly to the palace, others are sent to Peppa's house or to smaller, more discreet locations. The result is always the same: a new name, a new date, a new stain on a folded square of linen. The cedar chest grows heavier. Inside, each cloth rests like a page in a secret history, a history the court will never publish, but which every servant in the palace knows exists. It is an archive of domination. And like any archive, it is meticulously maintained. The king examines the cloths periodically, touching the silk wrapping, reading the inked names. Sometimes in the presence of his closest companions, he will take one out and speak of the lesson it represents. The rebellion crushed, the family silenced. Ministers know. They sit in council meetings and watch as decrees of arrest are signed with the same hand that folds the linen. They exchange glances when the king's list of rebel names includes details of their households. They know what those details mean, but they say nothing. To speak is to invite exile or worse. To question the king's private justice is to risk becoming the target of it. And so the ministers nod, agree, and turn their eyes to the parchment, pretending the ink hides no blood. Courtiers avert their eyes. They hear the rumors. They see the girls brought to the palace and leaving again, silent and altered. They watch the way the king lingers near the wives of political prisoners at court functions. But like the ministers, they remain still. Silence is the currency of survival. The church stays silent too. Bishops bless the king's campaigns against rebels and heretics, avoiding the matter of what happens to their daughters. The Pope sends polite letters urging unity and order, but never challenges the personal practices of the man who kneels at altars and funds cathedral renovations. In the eyes of the hierarchy, the preservation of the monarchy outweighs the defense of the individual soul. And so, the bed remains an unconfessed battlefield. This dual system of punishment becomes so consistent, so precise, that it almost resembles a military strategy. The gallows for the body of the man, the bed for the dignity of the family. The message is unmistakable. Defy the king, and you will lose more than your life. You will lose your bloodline's honor, your name's safety, your household's peace. The fear this generates is more potent than any army. Fathers warn their sons to hold their tongues not for fear of prison, but for fear of what might happen to their sisters. Mothers hush their children when they ask questions about the king, glancing nervously toward the windows as though walls might have ears. Spain learns to bleed twice, once in the public square and once behind closed doors. Every rebellion crushed under Ferdinand leaves two trails. One runs red down the gutters after executions, feeding the stray dogs that circle the gallows. The other is invisible, folded away in cedar, its scent of wood and iron, locked in a chamber no court historian will mention. The first trail fades in the rain. The second will linger for decades in the memories of those who survived it. Sometimes the two trails meet. After a public execution, the whispers begin before the body is cold. They took her. She's gone to the palace. She will not be the same. These whispers carry faster than proclamations, faster than the beat of the executioner's drum. They slip through marketplaces, across tavern tables, into the ears of children who will grow up knowing that in their country, the rope and the bed are ruled by the same crown. The cedar chest itself becomes a kind of myth. Servants speak of it in hushed tones, describing its weight, its carved edges, the faint smell of the silk cords binding it shut. Some claim to have seen it opened, to have glimpsed the folded squares, the careful ink. Others insist no one dares open it except the king himself. But whether seen or only imagined, it becomes the symbol of his reign, a private reliquary of conquest, each piece of cloth a relic of someone else's suffering. To the king, it is proof of his mastery. To the court, it is proof of his danger. To the people, it is proof of his reach. And still, it grows. When the uprisings come again, and they always do, the process repeats with mechanical precision. The rebels are hanged, the girls are summoned, the chest is fed. The stain spreads, not just on the linen, but on the fabric of the nation itself. And yet, not even queens are spared. For if the daughters of rebels can be made into symbols, so too can the wives of kings. The palace itself will become the scene of the same rituals, played out not in the shadows of the city, but under the chandeliers of the royal apartments. And in those chambers, the price of the crown will be measured not in jewels, but in screams. The royal apartments smell faintly of roses, but beneath the fragrance lies another scent, heavier, metallic, the kind that clings to stone after pain has passed through it. The walls are draped in crimson silk, and in the center of the room, A bed sits like a throne laid flat. It is not the marriage bed of fairy tales. It is an altar. And for Ferdinand VII, every queen who lies upon it is an offering. 3 women, 3 sacrifices, each a chapter in the same grim liturgy. The first is Maria Antonia of Naples, his cousin and first bride. She is 17, full of the bright energy of a southern court, raised among gardens and fountains. When she arrives in Spain in 1802, she brings laughter into the echoing halls. For a time. But behind the closed doors of the marital chamber, that brightness falters. Ferdinand, still young himself, is awkward, unskilled, and, most of all, unwilling to admit his limitations. The months pass without consummation, and whispers begin to crawl through the court like ants over spilled sugar. Maria Antonia writes desperate letters to her mother. He does not know what to do. He does not feel what a man should feel. Eventually, Ferdinand forces the issue. What follows is not union, but injury. Within weeks, she miscarries. The cycle repeats. Another attempt, another miscarriage. Her health declines rapidly, the color draining from her face, her body weakened by both grief and the strain of his assaults. At 21, she dies. Officially, the cause is tuberculosis, but in the private recollections of her ladies-in-waiting, the truth is different. She was worn down, body and spirit, by the very man meant to protect her. Maria Antonia's death teaches Ferdinand nothing about tenderness. It teaches him only that the crown shields him from consequence. The second queen is Maria Isabel of Braganza, a Portuguese princess known for her quiet dignity. She is cultured, charitable, and deeply religious. When she marries Ferdinand in 1816, she brings with her a vision of a better Spain, one where art, education, and reform might have a place. She commissions the Prado Museum, supports women's education, and encourages the king to embrace modern ideas. But her true value to Ferdinand lies not in her mind, but in her womb. When she becomes pregnant in 1818, the court breathes a sigh of relief. The long-awaited heir may finally be on the way. The pregnancy is difficult from the start. By the time labor begins, the child is in breach. The court physicians gather, their hands slick with sweat, whispering in corners. They tell the king there is a choice: save the child or save the mother. Ferdinand does not hesitate. Save the child, he orders. No anesthesia, no mercy. The surgeons cut her open while she is still conscious, still aware. Halfway through the procedure, her eyes fly open and a scream tears through the palace corridors. A sound so sharp that servants in distant rooms later claim they heard it. The baby is already dead. Maria Isabel bleeds out before dawn. She is 21 years old. The king mourns briefly, then begins the search for a new wife. The dead cannot produce heirs. The third queen is Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, the convent bride, whose wedding night was a scene of terror. She is 16 when she marries Ferdinand in 1819, and unlike the women before her, she refuses him not out of illness, but out of will. Night after night she lies motionless, murmuring prayers, turning the bed into an altar of resistance. She will not look at him. She will not speak. She will not move. Ferdinand tries persuasion, then threats, then mockery. She does not yield. Frustrated, he turns to the highest authority he can think of, the Pope. A letter is sent to Rome, a plea wrapped in royal entitlement. Convince her, he begs, that this is her duty as wife and queen. The Pope replies with diplomacy, urging obedience, urging submission. And Maria Josepha, obedient to the church if not to her husband, consents, but on her terms. She will close her eyes. She will pray throughout. She will think only of the Virgin Mary. Their marriage becomes the most joyless union in European royalty. 10 years of mechanical, perfunctory sex, 10 years without a child, 10 years of a queen silently enduring her king. When she dies of fever in 1829, the court, whispers relief. To Ferdinand, none of these women were companions. They were instruments, vessels for his bloodline, property of the state, extensions of his will. Their pain was not private tragedy. It was royal business. And each loss, each humiliation, each scream did not diminish him. It emboldened him. It cemented in his mind the belief that the throne and the bed were one and the same. That sovereignty was not only a matter of ruling over a kingdom, but over the bodies within it. By now, the palace is well practiced in accommodating this belief. Ministers speak in coded language when discussing matters of the succession. Courtiers avert their gaze when the king passes with a new bride on his arm. The church blesses each union, regardless of how the last ended. But the problem remains. There is still no heir. And for Ferdinand, that failure is intolerable. In the echo of Maria Josepha's death, the king's obsession hardens into desperation. He has tried 3 wives. He has forced, he has coerced, he has sacrificed, and yet the Bourbon line teeters on the brink of extinction. The court physicians know the truth. In quiet, guarded conversations, they admit what no one dares say aloud. Ferdinand's body is incompatible with the biological mechanics of reproduction. His grotesque proportions make conception not just difficult, but dangerous. But there is another truth, one Ferdinand refuses to see, that even if a child is conceived, the cost in blood and life may be too high to bear. It is in this moment of crisis that a new queen arrives, Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies. She is young, beautiful, but above all shrewd. She has heard the stories. She knows what happened to the women before her. And she arrives with her own calculation. If she is to survive, she must find a way to give Ferdinand what he wants without meeting the same fate. Maria Cristina studies her husband. She listens to the whispers of the physicians. She reads the reports hidden in locked drawers. And then she approaches the royal physician, Antonio Hernandez, with an extraordinary request. The solution will be unlike anything seen before in the history of monarchy. A creation that is part medical instrument, part shield, and part political gamble. A cushion. Not a soft, decorative pillow for lounging, but an engineered device made of the finest silk, stuffed with down, and cut with a precise cavity just deep enough to limit penetration while still allowing conception. A barrier between the queen's life and the king's demands. The idea is dangerous to present. Any implication that the king's body is a problem is an insult that could cost a life. So, Maria Cristina plays to his pride. She tells him it is not to diminish him, but to ensure his greatness continues. Only a man of his size, she says, would require such a thing. Ferdinand agrees, and so the cushion is made, a silk shield between a queen's survival and a king's obsession. When the night comes, the invention will be put to the test. And if it works, it will not only alter the fate of a dynasty, but become the strangest relic of a reign already steeped in blood, humiliation, and invention. The autumn of 1829 settles over Madrid like a silk shroud. The gardens of the royal palace turn brittle, leaves curling into crisp gold before being carried off by the wind. Behind the great stone walls, the air is tense, heavy with the scent of beeswax polish, incense, and something sharper. The anxiety of a dynasty on the brink. For Ferdinand VII, the season brings no peace. 3 queens have gone to their graves without giving him a son. 3 coffins have been lowered into consecrated earth, each carrying a woman whose body failed to deliver the future he demands. In the silence of his private chambers, the king paces, breath labored, swollen limbs straining against embroidered hose. His face, once merely bloated, is now ruddy and veined, like wine pressing against thin glass. And yet, in his mind, there is still time. There must be. The new queen, Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies, arrives at court that November. She is 23, young, luminous, and visibly different from her predecessors. Where Maria Antonia had been too open, too vulnerable, and Maria Isabel too trusting, Maria Christina's eyes are quick and calculating. She has been raised in the political labyrinth of Naples, where survival means reading every glance, weighing every word. From the moment she steps onto the marble floors of the palace, she moves as though she has been here before, gliding through conversations with the old nobility, smiling when needed, listening always. She is polite, devout, and attentive to the king, but beneath her veil of deference, she is assessing him piece by piece. It does not take long to confirm what she has already heard in whispers. Ferdinand's body is a contradiction, potent in rumor, dangerous in reality. His past marriages are a graveyard of women and unborn heirs. Maria Christina understands that if she does not outwit both his desire and his deformity, she will be next. Her first move is not to confront, but to learn. She summons the royal physician, Antonio Hernandez, under the pretense of discussing her general health. What begins as small talk about diet and rest soon turns to the topic no one dares broach in public, the mechanics of the royal bedchamber. Hernandez is cautious. His career depends on the king's favor, and the wrong word could see him banished. Or worse. But Maria Christina's manner is steady, her voice soft, and she frames her concern not as criticism, but as devotion. "I want to give His Majesty an heir," she says, "but I must also remain strong enough to serve him as queen." Slowly, Hernandez begins to speak. He explains what others have only implied, that Ferdinand's size and shape, the same ones he boasts about in drunken contests, are also the cause of failed pregnancies and fatal injuries. The truth is clinical, but the consequences are catastrophic. The solution, when it comes, is something no etiquette manual could have prepared for: a cushion. Not the kind that decorates a chaise or cradles a head, but a device engineered with precision. A square of the finest silk, embroidered subtly so it would not seem like a medical instrument. Inside, down and horsehair are packed to just the right density, forming a firm base. At its center, a shallow cavity is cut, no deeper than a thumb's length, designed to limit the depth of penetration. It is, in effect, a barrier between life and death. Enough contact to allow conception, not enough to destroy the queen's body. When Hernandez presents the design in secret, Maria Christina studies it in silence. It is absurd, it is humiliating, and yet it might save her. Convincing the king is a separate challenge. She approaches him on a night when the palace is quiet, when the only light comes from the great chandelier reflecting off gilt mirrors. She speaks in the language of flattery, telling him that this is no medical necessity, but an honor reserved for a man of exceptional royal proportions. "Only a king such as you," she murmurs, "would require a custom device to protect his queen." Ferdinand swells with pride. The idea amuses him. He imagines the whispers it will provoke, not of deformity, but of virility. And so he agrees. The first night is a strange ritual. Servants prepare the chamber with more care than usual, laying the cushion beneath the silk sheets, as though it were another piece of the royal regalia. Maria Christina enters in a gown of white lace, her hair braided with pearls, her expression composed. The act itself is awkward, mechanical, almost absurd in its choreography. The cushion is not a thing of romance. It is a compromise between two biological truths. Yet, when it is over, Maria Christina feels not relief, but the grim satisfaction of survival. She has endured without breaking. Weeks pass. Winter deepens. The court gossips quietly, some wagering that this marriage will end as the others did, in a funeral procession. But in the royal apartments, Maria Christina feels the first signs of change. A missed cycle, a wave of nausea in the morning, the swelling of her body. By the summer of 1830, the news cannot be contained. The queen is with child. Ferdinand is jubilant, strutting through the corridors, boasting to ministers, showering his wife with gifts. The cushion, now hidden away in a cedar chest, has done what nature alone could not. On the night of October 10, 1830, the palace is alive with tension. Midwives rush through the halls. Candles burn low, the air heavy with sweat and myrrh. Ferdinand waits in an adjoining room, pacing like a man awaiting the outcome of a battle. At dawn, the cry of a newborn pierces the silence. A daughter, Isabella, the heir to the Spanish throne. Though some courtiers mutter that a girl is not the victory they had hoped for, Ferdinand declares the birth a triumph. In his eyes, the Bourbon line has been secured. The child is christened Isabella II, her cradle draped in silk, her every breath watched over by guards. 2 years later, another daughter, Maria Luisa Fernanda, is born. The cushion is used again, its function now both practical and symbolic. A quiet, padded reminder that even the most ancient traditions can be bent to serve survival. But the device is more than a private oddity. Its very existence is a metaphor for Spain itself under Ferdinand, a nation forced to reshape itself to endure a ruler's deformity. Laws bent, rituals adapted, truths buried beneath layers of silk, all so that the crown might remain on his head. What was presented as a safeguard for the queen was, in truth, a safeguard for the monarchy. Yet for all its ingenuity, the cushion cannot protect Spain from the storms ahead. Ferdinand's health continues to decline, his legs swelling, his skin blotched, his temper fouler than ever. He clings to power as fiercely as he clings to his control over the women around him. And though the birth of Isabella secures a nominal heir, it also plants seeds of future conflict. For in a country still steeped in patriarchal tradition, a daughter's claim to the throne will be contested. And those contests will not be fought in the bedchamber, but on the battlefield. Bridge to closing chapters. The cushion has done its work. The queen has survived. The heir has been born. But in sparing a single life, it may have doomed thousands more. For when Ferdinand dies, Spain will be torn between those who accept a queen and those who will kill to see a king. And in that civil war, the true cost of one man's obsession will be paid in blood. The cradle of the infant princess still smelled of cedar and milk when the whispers began. In the shadowed corridors of the royal palace, they moved from mouth to mouth, hushed but sharp. She is not a son. By custom, the Bourbon dynasty had followed the Salic law, imported centuries earlier from France. It was a simple, brutal decree. No woman may inherit the throne of Spain. A daughter might inherit jewels, estates, and titles, but never the crown. Under this ancient law, the moment Ferdinand's heart stopped, the crown would pass to his younger brother, Don Carlos. For most kings, this was not a matter of personal insult. For Ferdinand, it was intolerable. The king had not endured decades of humiliation, gossip, and physical torment, had not bent the very laws of nature with a silk cushion, only to see his life's obsession end in his brother's grasp. The winter of 1830 deepened, and with it came Ferdinand's resolve. In private, he called the council, summoning ministers, legal scholars, and clerics. The chambers were lit by a single iron chandelier. Its candles dripped fat beads of wax onto the marble below. The king's voice, raspy from illness, carried across the cold air. Spain will not pass from my flesh to another man's. It will remain in my blood, even if that blood is carried in a daughter's veins. On March the 29th, 1830, the decree was issued. It bore the grand ceremonial name, the Pragmatic Sanction. In a stroke of the pen, Ferdinand overturned centuries of succession law. From that moment, the Salic law was gone, and Isabella was declared his lawful heir. The reaction was immediate. In the streets of Madrid, loyalists cheered, seeing in Isabella's tiny form a new age for Spain. They spoke of her as the Infanta Reina, the child queen-to-be, and printed her image on medallions and ribbons. But in the rural provinces, where tradition clung like lichen to stone, outrage boiled. Don Carlos's supporters denounced the sanction as treachery, treason against the natural order. From pulpits, priests thundered against it. In taverns, men swore allegiance not to the king, but to the king's brother. The name Carlist was born, not yet an army, but already a cause, its roots curling deep into the soil of Old Spain. Don Carlos himself was no subtle man. A rigid traditionalist, he believed the monarchy's power lay not in bending the past, but in preserving it exactly as it had been handed down. To him, the crown was a divine relic, not an ornament to be reworked for a king's vanity. In private letters to allies, Carlos did not bother with diplomacy. The king seeks to make of Spain his personal estate, to be given to a child who cannot wield a sword. I will not permit it. His words spread like dry tinder in a summer wind. At court, the air thickened with suspicion. Ministers chose their words carefully, for to praise Isabella was to insult Carlos, and to praise Carlos was to challenge Ferdinand himself. Even in the palace gardens, where ladies once walked freely, servants now lingered in earshot, reporting every conversation to one side or the other. Maria Cristina, ever watchful, understood the danger. She knew that the pragmatic sanction, while securing her daughter's claim, had also placed a target on the child's back. At night, she had Isabella's cradle moved to her own chamber, guarded by men whose loyalty she personally confirmed. Ferdinand, meanwhile, took satisfaction in the storm he had unleashed. The law was his to command. The nation, he believed, was an extension of his will. If Spain must fracture to preserve his line, then let it fracture. In public, he appeared on balconies with Isabella in his arms, presenting her to the crowds like a living seal of legitimacy. In private, he kept a wary distance from the growing rift between his supporters and the Carlists, telling himself it was a dispute that would fade in time. But it would not fade. It would sharpen. The years between 1830 and 1833 were years of decay for the king's body and for the country's stability. Ferdinand's health, already compromised by obesity, gout, and chronic illness, began to crumble. His legs swelled grotesquely. The skin stretched tight and shiny. The pain in his joints grew so severe that he sometimes dictated from a couch, unable to stand for long. Meanwhile, the Carlist network grew bolder. Secret gatherings were held in farmhouses and provincial estates. Funds were raised. Weapons were moved in carts hidden under hay. The church, or at least its more reactionary elements, offered quiet blessings to the cause, framing it as a fight for divine law against royal caprice. By 1832, the conflict reached a dangerous pitch. Rumors swirled that Ferdinand, weakened and feverish, might reverse the sanction under pressure from conservative ministers. One autumn evening, with the king bedridden, Maria Cristina intercepted a document that would have restored Don Carlos's claim. Accounts differ on whether she hid it, burned it, or simply refused to allow it to be signed. But when Ferdinand recovered weeks later, the sanction still stood. The episode convinced her of two things. First, that her daughter's future could vanish with a single pen stroke. Second, that when Ferdinand died, there would be no peaceful succession. In the final year of his reign, Ferdinand became a king at war with shadows. He could not travel the kingdom without passing through regions openly hostile to his decision. He could not attend Mass without sensing which priests prayed for his soul and which prayed for his undoing. And within the palace, his own brother's name was spoken more often than his own, not in loyalty, but in plotting. He aged quickly. His once bright eyes dulled to a rheumy haze, his voice cracked, his appetite shrank. But his will, the stubborn, choking force that had carried him through scandal, cruelty, and invention, did not waver. Isabella would inherit, even if the throne she inherited was drenched in blood. On September 29, 1833, Ferdinand VII lay dying in the royal palace. Outside, the city was restless. Armed patrols moved through the streets, their boots striking the cobblestones like the ticking of a clock. The king's breaths came in ragged pulls, each one a reminder that time was slipping. When the final rattle passed his lips, a bell tolled, not just for the death of a king, but for the breaking of Spain. For the moment the news spread, Don Carlos's followers declared Isabella's reign illegitimate. The Carlist Wars had begun. The silk cushion had preserved the queen. The pragmatic sanction had preserved the heir. But both had preserved something else, a fracture, running like a fault line beneath the kingdom. Now that Ferdinand was gone, that fracture would split wide open, and the blood he had spilled in secret would be matched by blood in the open fields of Spain. The air in Madrid on September 29, 1833, was heavy with the copper tang of autumn. The leaves along the palace promenade clung stubbornly to their branches, as if refusing to fall before the king did. Inside, the royal palace was silent except for the rasping breath of Ferdinand VII. He lay propped against a mound of pillows, each one stained with the sheen of his fevered nights. His skin had the waxen pallor of an extinguished candle. The once thick bourbon lips now cracked and dry. His legs, grotesquely swollen, mottled with purples and blues, stuck out beneath the weight of a golden brocade coverlet, a final pretension of majesty wrapped around a failing body. The courtiers stood in the shadows, not too close. They had seen the sores, smelled the rot. Death was coming, and it carried with it the scent of damp earth and a century's worth of grudges. The final breath came not with a roar, but with a wet, rattling sigh. Somewhere deep in the palace, a signal was given, and the bells began to toll. Slow, measured, dutiful, but not mournful. There were no crowds weeping in the streets, no wailing masses tearing their garments as they once had for kings who had expanded empires or defended faith. This was a different passing, a death acknowledged out of protocol, not love. To many, Ferdinand's departure was not the end of an age, but the lifting of a weight. Yet even in death, he would not be exiled from grandeur. His body was dressed in the finest robes and placed in the royal funeral carriage. Priests murmured Latin, their voices steady, their eyes vacant. The cortege wound its way to the pantheon of the kings at El Escorial, the resting place of conquerors, empire builders, and monarchs whose names were etched in glory. There, Ferdinand VII was laid among them, but his legacy was not conquest. It was corrosion. Even before the tomb was sealed, Spain began to fracture. The ink on the pragmatic sanction was barely 3 years dry. Don Carlos, Ferdinand's brother, wasted no time declaring it illegitimate. Across the provinces, banners rose in the name of the Carlist cause. Villages chose sides. Brothers sharpened blades against brothers. The first Carlist war had begun before the burial earth had settled on the king's coffin. The country would bleed for years over a decision born from a man's vanity. But war was only the public inheritance he left behind. The private one was still hidden, locked behind a door that only one person in the palace dared open. Maria Cristina moved through her late husband's chambers as one might walk through the ruins of a burned house, careful not to touch anything too closely, lest it crumble in her hands. The rooms were still thick with his scent, an oppressive mix of ambergris cologne, pipe smoke, and the sour tang of sickness. Curtains hung limp in stale air. The wax from half-burned candles had pooled in hardened rivers along the mantel. She moved past the bed, past the dressing table cluttered with combs and flasks, to a corner most avoided, a small alcove where a cedar chest sat beneath a dust-dulled mirror. Its brass fittings were cold to the touch. The lock yielded to a single key she kept tucked inside her bodice. The lid opened with a groan. Inside, beneath layers of folded silk, were the trophies. Blood-stained cloths, each one pressed flat, each one tagged with a scrap of parchment. Names, dates, locations, written in the same practiced hand. They were not random relics. They were a ledger, a record, a history written not in ink, but in the bodily ruin of women. The first was dated to the early years of his reign. The last, shockingly, was recent, just months before his illness took him to bed. Maria Cristina sat before the chest for a long time. She did not weep. She did not flinch. She only stared, as though trying to see the women behind the stains, to imagine their voices before they were silenced. She knew what it meant for these to remain. The whispers about Ferdinand's appetites had always been there, but this was proof. Tangible. Unignorable. And proof was dangerous. That night, in the palace gardens, she set the fire herself. The cedar chest was dragged to a secluded corner where the trees leaned in close. The silk bundles were tossed into the flames one by one. They curled and blackened quickly, the stains turning to shadow, the parchment tags glowing before collapsing into embers. The smoke that rose was bitter, almost metallic, and it hung in the still night air like a curse. Some servants watched from a distance, others turned away. Too many saw. Too many would remember. Burning the cloths might erase the objects, but it could not erase the memory, or the knowledge that such a collection had ever existed. By morning, nothing was left but ash scattered in the damp grass. Maria Cristina returned to the palace, knowing the war outside was just beginning, but also sensing another war, quieter but no less vicious, would be fought in whispers and rumors for years to come. Ferdinand's ghost now belonged to Spain, and it was a ghost made of two faces: the public king, who had bent the law for his heir, and the private man who had filled a cedar chest with conquest after conquest. In the weeks after his death, the city of Madrid changed. Carlist supporters marched openly in the plazas, their shouts echoing off stone facades. Loyalists to the young Queen Isabella countered with their own rallies. The streets became battlegrounds of words, soon to be replaced by gunfire. Maria Cristina governed as regent, her hands full with generals, ministers, and clerics, demanding decisions that would shape the war. Yet always, in the quiet hours, she felt the weight of that other inheritance, the knowledge of what her daughter's father had been. For all the blood about to be spilled in his name, none of it would wash away what she had seen in that chest. At El Escorial, the king's tomb remained still and silent, but Spain above ground was coming apart. And in the parlors and corridors of the palace, there were moments when Maria Cristina thought she caught the scent of cedar in the air. Faint, impossible, but there. As though the ghost of the chest, and of the man who filled it, had seeped into the stones themselves. Bridge to Chapter 10. The war would rage in the mountains and fields, but in the capital, another kind of conflict would fester. A battle to define Ferdinand's memory. Was he the savior of his bloodline, or the butcher of his people? The truth, as always, was both. And the shadow of that truth was about to stretch over a nation in flames. The dawn that crowned Isabella, the second Queen of Spain, was pale and uncertain, much like the child herself. She was barely 3 years old when her father's body was sealed inside El Escorial. The bells had tolled for him, but the echo of his name was not reverent. It was muttered in taverns and whispered in corridors, bound to stories too sordid for official chronicles. And yet, here she was, the living proof of his victory over nature, conceived with the aid of silk and necessity, the child of a cushion built to spare a queen's life. Her mother, Maria Cristina, ruled as regent in those early years, fighting wars abroad and battles at court, all while protecting Isabella from the thick shadow of Ferdinand's legacy. But shadows do not remain outside the nursery. They creep in, soft as a servant's step, until a child grows up thinking darkness is simply the color of the walls. As Isabella's childhood slipped into adolescence, the whispers began again, not of her father, but of her own court. The young queen's education was shallow, more ceremony than substance. Tutors filled her with piety and etiquette, but left her naive to the machinery of politics. This ignorance became the soft soil in which others planted their ambitions. Ministers, generals, and priests, all tried to mold her into their vision of a monarch. But Isabella had inherited something from Ferdinand beyond his bloodline, a restless hunger, not for governance, but for personal indulgence. The court became her stage, and the nobility her audience. Rumors of her first lovers began before she turned 20. They were officers, courtiers, even singers, chosen less for influence and more for beauty or charm. The line between her private life and her public role blurred until there was no line at all. In Madrid, the people began to talk. They remembered the stories of Ferdinand's midnight hunts, his games in the brothels, his trophies hidden in silk. Now they saw a queen who replaced ministers based not on policy, but on pillow talk. Decisions of state seemed to pass not through the council chamber, but through the bedroom. Illegitimate children appeared in the palace wings, their existence quietly acknowledged by servants and loudly debated in the cafes. The official heirs bore the Bourbon name, but the faces of some seemed to echo others. A certain officer, a certain chamberlain. For the common people, monarchy was no longer cloaked in divine right. It was draped in the wrinkled sheets of scandal. Spain itself was unraveling. The 19th century was an age of revolutions, and Isabella's reign unfolded against a backdrop of constant unrest, uprisings in the provinces, colonial troubles abroad, and a capital seething with discontent. The liberal and conservative factions tore at each other, and the Queen's open favoritism only deepened the fractures. Where Ferdinand had ruled with cruelty, Isabella ruled with carelessness. Ministers who displeased her could be undone by a rival's whisper at night. Policies shifted not with the will of the people, but with the fleeting whims of passion. The court became a carousel of lovers and favorites, each rising swiftly in influence and falling just as fast. Every departure left behind a trail of bitterness, and every arrival brought new enemies. By the 1860s, Spain's patience was thinning to nothing. Taxes rose, corruption swelled. The church still held enormous power, but even it began to waver in loyalty. When famine struck in some regions, the Queen's indifference was not merely criticized, it was branded as proof of moral rot. The image of the monarchy had degraded beyond repair. For decades, it had been shielded by ceremony and tradition, but now the gilt was peeling, and underneath was only rust. The final blow came in 1868. A coalition of military leaders and politicians, weary of the scandals, the waste, and the instability, decided that the Bourbon experiment had run its course. In September, the Glorious Revolution swept through Spain. Cities rose in revolt. Garrisons turned against the crown. When the troops approached Madrid, Isabella did not stand to fight. She fled, first to France, then deeper into exile. Her departure was as unceremonious as her father's death. No grand farewell, no masses begging her to stay. The streets that had once echoed with the sound of royal processions now carried only the shuffle of soldiers' boots and the murmur of a people adjusting to life without their queen. Exile did not end the gossip. In Paris, Isabella lived comfortably, her fortune intact, her habits unchanged. She continued to surround herself with companions of her choosing, continued to drift between the worlds of royalty and scandal. To some, she was a tragic figure, a woman ill-prepared for the role forced upon her, shaped by a poisoned inheritance. To others, she was simply her father's daughter, proof that the rat in the Bourbon dynasty had not died with Ferdinand VII, but had only changed its form. For Spain, the monarchy's collapse was more than a political crisis. It was an unmasking. Generations had been taught to see the crown as sacred, a vessel of God's will on earth. But by the end of Isabella's reign, the crown had been revealed as nothing more than a bauble, tarnished, battered, passed between unworthy hands. The Bourbon name, once a symbol of stability, had become shorthand for excess and failure. And the origin of that decay, in the minds of many, could be traced like a blood-stained thread back to Ferdinand's cedar chest, to the silk cushion in Maria Christina's bedchamber, to the moment monarchy and predation became one and the same. In the dim corridors of El Escorial, where Ferdinand's tomb rests among kings who had built empires, the stone is silent. But history speaks. It says that thrones can be toppled not only by enemies at the gate, but by the appetites of those who sit upon them. Isabella II, the daughter of the cushion, was both a victim and an accomplice, shaped by a father she barely knew, yet echoing his flaws until they consumed her reign. Her fall was not sudden. It was the slow collapse of a dynasty hollowed out from within. Spain would see kings again, and the Bourbon name would return. But the shadow of Ferdinand and his daughter would linger, a reminder that the crown, once stained, never truly shines again. And in the whispers of history, their reigns would be told not as tales of majesty, but as warnings of what happens when the private sins of a monarch become the destiny of a nation. The crown of Spain is heavy, not in gold, but in history. Its curve has rested on the brows of warriors, empire builders, and saints, but it has also sat unshaken on the heads of tyrants and fools. In the autumn light of history, Ferdinand VII's reign stands as something more than a dark chapter. It is a dissection of monarchy itself. Strip away the trumpets, the embroidered banners, the incense curling in cathedral air, and what remains? A man, flesh and bone, appetite and fear. In Ferdinand's case, a body deformed and a will sharpened into cruelty, given the divine sanction of a crown. It begins with a truth so many wish to ignore. Kings are not born from marble. They sweat, they ache, they hunger. And when the man inside the crown is broken, the institution bends to protect him, not the people. Ferdinand was not merely a bad ruler. He was a monarch whose very biology became a political fact. His body's deformity dictated the rhythms of court life, the futures of queens, even the engineering of strange and intimate devices. Spain adapted. Seamstresses sewed not gowns, but silk cushions to facilitate an heir. Midwives stood ready in palace corridors, their hands steady not from reverence, but necessity. Ministers rewrote laws to protect his legacy. Priests offered blessings over acts that would have damned a common man. The state itself reshaped around the peculiar demands of one man's anatomy and pride. The true horror is not in Ferdinand's appetites alone, but in the quiet complicity that fed them. The church, that ancient moral pillar, whispered prayers over his bedchamber rather than condemn the violence committed within it. Confessors heard sins that could have split kingdoms and offered absolution like a perfumed glove to mask a rotting wound. Ministers, sworn to uphold the law, became enablers. They drafted decrees to protect his power, ignored whispers from the streets, and helped bury truths beneath layers of court protocol. When the cedar chest in his chambers grew heavy with silk-wrapped proof of his violations, no one dared open it, at least not while the king still drew breath. Even the people, the very subjects upon whom the monarchy claimed divine guardianship, became participants through silence. Fear is a great teacher, and Ferdinand ruled with both the rope and the rumor. To speak against him was to risk the noose, or worse, the king's private attention. Every king leaves a legacy. Ferdinand's was not in new palaces or foreign conquests, but in the blueprint he left for how an entire nation can warp itself to protect the rot at its center. Consider the Pragmatic Sanction of 1830, a legal sleight of hand that overturned centuries of tradition to place his daughter on the throne. It was not a reform born from justice or principle, but from vanity and control. He had suffered too much mockery, endured too many humiliations to hand the crown to his brother. The law bent, and with it, the nation's spine. In the short term, it sparked civil war, the Carlist Wars, rivers of blood flowing from a decision made not for Spain, but for Ferdinand himself. In the long term, it set a precedent. The law was not sacred. It was clay, to be reshaped by the man who wore the crown. And yet, perhaps the deepest wound he left was not political but cultural. For centuries, monarchy in Spain had been draped in the language of divine right. The king was God's anointed, a shepherd to his people, a symbol of unity. But Ferdinand's reign ripped away the veil. His personal vices were not hidden in dusty corridors. They spilled into the streets, whispered in the plazas, sung in the taverns. The people saw the throne not as a sacred seat, but as a stage for indulgence and exploitation. They saw queens not as consorts, but as sacrifices. They saw law bent not to justice, but to one man's insecurities. This revelation did not die with him. It seeped into the reign of his daughter, Isabella II, and into the glorious revolution that cast her out. It lingered in the political instability that followed, in the cynicism toward rulers, in the constant hum of suspicion toward any who claimed divine authority. There is a lesson here, though it is not a comfortable one. No institution, however ancient or revered, can rise above the flaws of the flesh that wears its crown. The crown may glitter, but it is not magic. It does not purify. It does not heal. Place it on a tyrant's head, and it will not make him noble. It will make his tyranny ceremonial. Place it on the broken, and it will make his wounds the blueprint for the realm. In Ferdinand's Spain, we see how quickly ceremony becomes complicity, how tradition can become a weapon, how an entire nation can be made to kneel not to virtue, but to pathology. Ferdinand's tomb lies among the conquerors of El Escorial, but his name belongs to no great victories. His empire was no empire at all, but a web of courtiers, clerics, and laws all straining to hold up the fiction of majesty. In that sense, his reign was not just the story of a man, but of a system, one that could adapt itself endlessly to protect the very thing destroying it. The cedar chest was burned after his death, but its contents live on in the memory of Spain. The cushion was hidden away, but its shape remains in the whispers of historians. And the crown? It still rests on the heads of kings, lighter in gold perhaps, but heavy with the lesson that Ferdinand left, that even the most brilliant metal can hide the smell of decay. For a time, history remembers Ferdinand VII, not because he was the worst man to wear a crown, but because he showed, in silks and laws, in blood, prayer, just how far a nation will go to keep the illusion of kingship alive, even when the king himself is the rot at its core. The air in El Escorial is always cool. Stone breathes differently here, slow, ancient, as though it has learned patience from centuries of kings lying beneath it. In the dim light of the Pantheon, marble faces stare outward from their tombs. Charles V, Philip II, men who bent continents to their will. Their carved eyes are steady, their robes frozen in folds of white perfection. Tourists shuffle past in hushed tones, their footsteps swallowed by the cold floor. And then, among them, the likeness of Ferdinand VII. His effigy lies serene, hands folded across his chest, the weight of centuries resting lightly on his sculpted brow. The chisel has been kind. The stone shows none of the deformities, none of the cruelty, none of the grotesque private inventions that defined his reign. The marble is a mask. The truth lies not here in the carved silence, but in the rooms above, in the palace where he lived, where the air once smelled of cedar and blood. The cushion is gone, locked away in some forgotten vault. The cedar chest has been reduced to ash, its silk wrappings turned to smoke. But their absence does not erase them. The palace walls remember. They have memory in the way that old wood remembers storms. The warping, the faint scent of rot, the way it leans under a weight no one speaks of. Those walls remember the muffled screams of queens. They remember the soft tread of courtiers turning away. They remember the sound of silk tearing, the rasp of a lock turning in a door, the muted prayers that were not answered. Outside those walls, the streets remember too. Madrid's stones once felt the boots of soldiers sent to crush dissent, and the cobblestones were slick with the blood of rebels. The city's women knew the pattern. After every execution in the square, a carriage would leave the palace, curtains drawn, and return hours later in silence. Some kings conquer with armies. Ferdinand conquered with proximity. His cruelty was not only public policy, it was intimate, private, invasive. His weapons were not always rifles and rope, but hands, breath, weight. That was his genius as a tyrant, the ability to make his victims carry his reign in their own bodies. This is why he was more dangerous than the despots who came before him. A tyrant who kills his enemies may silence their voices, but a tyrant who breaks their daughters poisons generations. He turns the bloodline itself into a message. Defy me, and your name will live on, not in glory, but in shame. This was Ferdinand's Spain, a kingdom not conquered from without, but consumed from within. The armies were still, the borders intact, but the rot was in the marrow. And yet, in the end, marble remembers differently than flesh. Here in El Escorial, he rests beside kings whose legacies are told in maps and treaties, in cathedrals and victories. His own story is told in whispers, in locked archives, in footnotes to scandals the official histories gloss over. To the casual visitor, his tomb is just another monument, but to history, real history, the kind that listens to the silences, it is a warning carved in stone. The warning is simple. Monsters do not always come cloaked in shadows. Some wear gold-threaded robes. Some are carried through cathedrals under a canopy, incense rising like the breath of God. And when the trappings of majesty are wrapped around them, when the crown is set upon their head, their cruelty is no less savage, only sanctified. Ferdinand's reign proved that the most dangerous tyrants are those whose violence is personal, whose reach is as close as a hand across a mouth, as intimate as a breath in the ear. For them, the court is not just a place of politics, it is a hunting ground. The marble effigy cannot show the cost of that kind of rule. It cannot carve the faces of the women who did not live to tell their stories. It cannot hold the weight of the cedar chest or the stifled cries that filled it, folded neatly into silk. Nor can it capture the other kind of cost, the political inheritance of his cruelty. The crown he passed on carried the same poison. His daughter's court became a mirror of his own. Scandal, indulgence, the slow bleed of legitimacy. Spain's monarchy survived the man, but not the rot he left behind. By the time Isabella II was cast out in 1868, the Bourbon throne was no longer a sacred relic. It was a piece of furniture in a theater, its authority eroded by decades of waste, its dignity stripped bare. And yet, the marble endures. People will always be drawn to stone. It promises permanence. It promises that something here will last, even if memory fades. But the truest monument to Ferdinand Zaguiar is not the marble above his bones. It is the shadow he left across a nation's soul. It lingers in the caution of ministers who fear personal scandal more than public outrage. It echoes in the willingness of institutions to bend themselves around the will of one man. It hides in the knowledge that cruelty can thrive in daylight, provided it wears the right robes and speaks the right prayers. That is why his story matters, not because he was uniquely evil. History is littered with men who were worse, but because he showed how easily a system can be warped when the man at its center is broken, and how far a nation will go to protect the fiction of kingship, even when it must be built on blood and silence. He is gone. The cedar chest is ash. The cushion is dust. The queens are long buried. But as long as crowns exist, so too does the danger of another monster wearing one. Because the crown is not a cure, it is an amplifier. In the dim light of the Pantheon, tourists still pass, their eyes gliding over his sculpted form. Some linger, some move on. Few know the real shape of the man beneath the stone, but the walls remember, the streets remember, and history, patient, unblinking, and merciless, remembers. For in the end, the marble may outlast the flesh, but the shadow outlasts them both.